I teach a course in the second year, American Indian History. And increasingly over the last few years, I've become very interested in the scholarship that's being produced by lots of American Indian writers and historians who want to compare the experiences of American Indians in 19th century America, and more broadly, we'll talk about that in a second, with the kind of experiences that the Jewish community experienced during World War II. And the conclusion of these discussions is that a lot of American Indian scholars want to call the experiences of the 19th century a Holocaust. They want to use that word, not just the word genocide, but they want to use the word Holocaust. And there are two different ways of introducing this. Firstly, some want to throw it right back historically and talk about since the landing of Columbus in 1492, there's been, in terms of population loss, about a 98% crash in population figures. It runs into the tens of millions of people. And so this is a mix of disease and warfare and so on, but a huge loss of life. Others want more specifically to focus on just the 19th century and what some scholars refer to as Nazi-esque dynamics of government policy in the 19th century. So things like longer walks, which are forced marches, hundreds and hundreds of miles through the middle of winter. Men are very often chained together. They're at gunpoint. Anyone that fell behind was simply shot. Pregnant women were just left behind in ditches, and so on. So long walks, massacres, the creation of very squalid reservations, and government propaganda that talked about American Indians as lesser people, as very much inferior, as savages that needed to be wiped out in order that civilization could tame the continent. And so a lot of these scholars talk about the relationship between the Nazi philosophy of Lebensraum, or Lebensraumpolitik, and Manifest Destiny, which is the American philosophy of growth and expansion, and the fact that the two philosophies have very underlying similarities, which are quite disturbing. So there's obviously a backlash to this. A lot of historians suggest that the word Holocaust should remain unique, that it should remain as a unique label for the experiences of the Jewish community in World War II, and these are usually referred to as the exclusivist school, the exclusivist historians. So it's a vibrant debate. It's a very emotional debate. It's a very sensitive debate. It's very difficult to teach. It's very, very difficult to teach. It splits the room every single year. And so the way that I've started to approach it is to have several weeks leading up to a debate. So there's about 3 weeks of preparation where we talk about context, we talk about propaganda and so on, and then the groups form into two, and then there's a 2-hour-long debate with a break in the middle. So as if this weren't sensitive enough, Ward Churchill, an American Indian scholar, calls exclusivists Holocaust deniers because he argues they don't recognize the inhumanity of what occurred in America. So he says this is the greatest irony of all, is that a lot of Jewish historians especially deny the fact that another Holocaust took place. So how on earth do we teach this? How do we go about teaching this in a classroom setting? And so this was the genesis of the idea of just teaching difficult things more generally. And I teach a lot of courses on racial violence, on race relations. How do we talk about, for example, in America, the history of lynching, the history of racial violence in America, racial rioting. There's a lot of support for teaching in terms of really good films, documentaries, which allows me not to offer my voice all the time. So there's a lot of really excellent support materials for the students to get stuck into. So more broadly, how do we use these provocative texts? And especially in American Indian studies, I'm finding that the sources are incredibly opposed to each other very often. They are incendiary arguments. How, for example, do we use photographs of public lynchings, which unbelievably people sent as postcards? Public lynchings, thousands of people went to watch people being hanged, being burnt alive, being mutilated, and then they would gather parts of the bodies as mementos, and the photographs of the lynchings would then be sent to relatives around the country as postcards to commemorate the fact that they were present. So, for example, here, just thousands of people would receive this postcard of hundreds of people on a bridge proudly posing with people hanging from the bridge itself. How do we teach about ethical issues such as repatriation when thousands, hundreds of thousands of human remains, skulls, various body parts, are stored not just in private museums but in federally funded public museums in America and also in Britain as well, the British Museum, thousands of human remains. Should they be repatriated? How do we talk about and teach about racism? How do we teach about intolerance? And so inevitably, conversations started happening, networks and links started to really open up the variety of angles and perspectives that were involved in teaching difficult things. How do we teach within humanities, for example? How do we teach 200 years of history in a 3-week survey course? How do we select themes? How do we omit others? How do we make that choice? How do we edit our own history and edit our own teaching of history? How do we teach about the ways in which a country chooses to construct its own identity? And this is especially the case when a country is perhaps trying to airbrush out or revise its own history, when it's talking about slavery or colonialism or genocide. How do we teach particularly sophisticated theoretical subjects? A boring book, a boring film. How do we do that? How do we go about it so that we don't just project that boring nature to the students? How do we teach about something that we passionately disagree with? So what is the role of the lecturer? What is our place in terms of objectivity and subjectivity? Are we supposed to be always objective? Can we be subjective? And how is the role of the student and their own learning experience affected in this process? So how do we teach, for example, when we know that students will inevitably become upset by a certain subject? We know that this will happen. How do we respond and how do we alter? Should we teach or should we alter our teaching? How do we teach when we know that there's going to be conflict in the classroom? Should we have trigger warnings? And America is going through a huge debate about trigger warnings at the moment, which is spreading over here to a certain extent. Should we warn students of content in the lectures so that they can choose whether to come or not in the event that they might be offended by a topic being taught? So it's a very big, really interesting theoretical debate that's happening at the moment. So clearly it's a rich theme for all kinds of discussion, and this colloquium acts as a soft launch of a new pedagogical research centre that focuses on this very topic of teaching difficult things. I'm in the paperwork stages, what a joy at the moment, of putting the centre together. It's likely to be a school centre, but as I mentioned at the start, very, very open and outward facing. So right through the process, I would welcome any involvement or interest, collaboration with colleagues from other schools in the faculty about how we can really energise this centre so that it can be involved in some really interesting things. I wanted to reach out to schools in the area about how we teach certain things in primary schools and secondary schools, as well as how we debate things within a university setting as well. And I'd like there to be quite frequent colloquiums of this nature. So thank you for all your contributions today. I want to keep these conversations going, and I hope you find it really as interesting as I do. So thank you so much.
Okay, is there anybody who wants to make an intervention at this point, or ask Sam anything further? Clearly, this is the framework that we're using across the day, and so it'll be coming up in each session. But if anybody has a question for Sam? Yeah, Ben.
The reservation of the term Holocaust, what's your opinion on that? Because I don't think it should be reserved for World War II. I think if there were atrocities that came previously, then that term could still be used for those type of... Yeah, I was just wondering what your opinion is of that.
Yeah, exclusivists would say that where do we draw the line? So that if we start using the word Holocaust for something else, then there'll be dozens of Holocausts, and the meaning of the word will be diluted to the extent that it won't be seen as unbelievably awful as it was in World War II. But so you get this kind of hierarchy of evil, and my own opinion is that it should be used to describe the American Indian experience. I think I really do think it should, and I do actually agree with Lord Chipton to a great extent that there is a denial of the Holocausts that happened.
Okay.
Yeah, Quanjana?
Hello, I have one observation. I found it interesting thing about objectivity and subjectivity as a lecturer, because it's my first year in HE as a lecturer, and I teach journalism, which has many subjects are awash with what is balance, what is objectivity. And I've struggled this year with knowing where to draw the line of my own personal beliefs, teaching journalism students about the world, because they're just wide-eyed, want to learn, and I've really struggled with how much I hold myself back in saying this is how things are, I believe this. Because I want to change the world a little bit in my own little way when I can, but then I also think, is that right that I'm doing that? Is that appropriate for a lecturer? So I'm really keeping excited to get on there.
Sam, can I just ask you, when you do the debates with the students,
Yes.
Is the energy force positive enough to overcome any sense of difficulty that might actually leave the room with the students? You know what I mean? Does that debating structure help them kind of unravel those kind of tensions and fears?
I think it does, but I think I'm very careful in not letting them have any hints of how I feel about it.
Right.
So when the debate actually happens, they feel as if they're talking to each other, and that barrier that you sometimes get when a student asks a question, the question is somehow affected by the way that they think.
Yeah, you're going to respond. Yeah.
So if they're just talking to each other, what tends to happen is it's a little bit more open, I think, and a bit more honest. And I say to them, there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. That you can swap sides if you want to, and people do. People get up and walk over to the other side of the room. They swap during the middle of the debate, and they generally see it as a very constructive exercise. Yeah, they really do.